finally found a fella almost completely divine, but his vocabulary is killing this romance of mine. We get into an intimate situation, and then begins this Romeo's conversation. He says murder, he says every time we kiss, he says murder, he says at a time like this, and that murder, he says, is that the language of love. He says solid, he says, takes me in his arms and says solid, he says, meaning all my charms, he says solid, he says, is that the language of love. He says, chick, chick, you torture me so tar we living, I'm thinking of leaving him flat. He says, dig, dig, the jumps the old ticker is giving. Now he can talk plainer than that. He says, murder, he says, every time we kiss, he says, murder, he says, keep it up like this, and that murder, he says, in that impossible tone, will bring on nobody's murder but his own. He says, Jackson, he says, and my name's Murray. He says, Jackson, he says, shoot the snoot to me. He says, Jackson, he says, is that the language of love? He says, woof, woof, he says, when he likes my hat, he says, now what the heck is that? He says, woo, woo, he says, is that the language of love? He says, hep, hep, with helium now, babe, we're cooking in other expressions to it. He says, we're in the grove, and the grove is good looking. It sounds like his uppers don't fit. He says, murder. He says, murder. And that murder, he says, in that impossible tone, will bring on nobody's murder but his